man sits alone in a candlelit room, surrounded by 1,000 photographs of the same woman's smile. In each frame, her expression is identical, but he keeps taking more pictures, convinced the next one will finally capture what he's truly seeking. You've felt this hunger before, that electric pull when someone new enters your orbit, the way their laugh seems to unlock rooms in your chest you'd forgotten existed. It begins so simply, a glance across a crowded space, a shared joke that feels like a secret language only you two understand. The world suddenly has color where there was once only gray. But watch what happens next. Our man, let's call him Marcus, has moved beyond the ordinary rhythms of attraction. In his dim apartment, the walls have become a shrine, not to the woman, but to the feeling she gives him. Each photograph represents a moment when her attention was fully his, when her eyes held him like a prayer. The camera would clicks obsessively, her morning coffee ritual, the way sunlight catches her hair during their walks, the exact angle of her head when she listens to music. The air grows thick with the scent of developing chemicals and desperation. Marcus has built elaborate filing systems, albums organized by mood, by lighting, by the precise degree of her smile. He studies them like a scholar, decoding ancient texts, searching for the mathematical formula that will make her love him the way he loves the idea of being loved by her. His fingers trace the edges of frames worn smooth from handling, his eyes red from squinting at details that exist only in his imagination. But here's what Marcus cannot see. The woman in the photographs has begun to fade, not literally. The images remain pristine, but the living, breathing person behind them grows more distant with each captured moment. She has become a commodity in his museum of manufactured intimacy. When she speaks of her fears, he photographs her tears. When she shares her dreams, he frames her passion. He collects her authenticity like butterfly wings pressed between glass, beautiful but utterly lifeless. The room pulses with the mechanical heartbeat of camera shutters and film advance wheels. Marcus has surrounded himself with 10,000 perfect moments, each one stealing a piece of the imperfect, beautiful reality he claims to love. As Schopenhauer knew well, all love is rooted in the sexual impulse alone, not in the beloved themselves, but in what they represent to our hungry, grasping will to possess and consume. The climax arrives on an ordinary Tuesday. The woman, Sarah, discovers his shrine, but instead of the romantic gesture he imagined, she sees something else entirely. Herself transformed into an object, her humanity dissolved into his need to control and capture. She looks around at the thousands of images and asks the question that shatters his carefully constructed world. When did you stop seeing me and start collecting me? Marcus stares at his photographs and for the first time notices what his obsession has hidden. In every single frame, Sarah's eyes look somewhere else, never at him, always beyond him, toward a freedom he has spent months trying to eliminate. This is what psychology calls objectification, the reduction of a person to a thing that exists solely for another's consumption. First identified by feminist philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, it manifests today in the swipe-right culture of dating apps, the Instagram archives we build of people we've never truly met, and the way we curate relationships like personal brands. We photograph our meals, our lovers, our children, believing that if we capture enough perfect moments, we can possess the joy they represent. Through Schopenhauer's lens, this is the will's most cunning deception. It convinces us that love is about having, when love is actually about being present with what cannot be possessed. The will whispers that if we just collect enough evidence of being loved, we can finally escape the fundamental loneliness of existence. But each photograph, each preserved text message, each saved voicemail becomes another bar in the prison we mistake for paradise. In the end, love becomes the very serpent that strangles what it claims to protect, coiling tighter around authentic connection until nothing remains but the hollow echo of our own need, reflected back from the eyes of someone who has learned to fear our affection. What are you trying to capture that you're afraid to simply experience? What moments are you preserving instead of living? And what real intimacy are you sacrificing on the altar of your need to possess proof that you are loved? The collector sits alone among his perfect moments, each one a small death dressed as devotion. In the silence between camera clicks, you can almost hear the sound of love suffocating under the weight of its own desperate need to be held. A woman stands in the center of a grand ballroom, surrounded by admirers, yet she cannot move a single step. The chains that bind her are made of their expectations, their needs, their whispered promises, and she forged every link herself. It starts innocently enough, this dance of accommodation. A small adjustment here, a little white lie there. You've done it. We all have. That moment when you swallow your real opinion because disagreement might disturb the delicate ecosystem of someone else's approval. The first link in the chain feels weightless, almost noble. You're being considerate. You're being loving. Meet Evelyn, who has elevated this art to a form of psychological architecture. In the surreal theater of her mind, she moves through rooms that shift and reshape themselves according to whoever walks through the door. With her mother, the walls become soft pastels, and the furniture rearranges itself into safe, familiar patterns. The air fills with the scent of the perfume she's always worn, vanilla and roses, because that's what mothers expect their daughters to smell like. Her voice adjusts its pitch higher, softer, more deferential. Step into the next room and watch the transformation. Her lover arrives, and the space morphs into something sultry and mysterious. The lighting dims to warm amber, candles appear from nowhere, and suddenly, Evelyn's laugh becomes throatier, more confident. She's read the books he mentioned liking, developed opinions about wine because he collects bottles, learned to find jazz appealing because he plays saxophone on weekends. The air tastes different here, complex, sophisticated, tinged with the metallic flavor of performed passion. Another door opens, her colleagues enter, and the room becomes sharp angles and clean lines. Evelyn's posture straightens, her vocabulary becomes more precise, more gender-neutral. She's learned to speak in the cadence of boardroom success, to dress her femininity in acceptable corporate camouflage. The space smells of coffee and subtle ambition, and her gestures become economical, controlled. She has studied the body language of women who are taken seriously, and she wears it like armor. But here's where the fable turns sinister. As Evelyn perfects each performance, she begins to forget which room contains her authentic self. The walls between her staged identities start to blur and buckle. Sometimes her corporate voice bleeds into intimate moments, making her lover feel like he's in bed with a stranger. Sometimes her daughter's self emerges during professional negotiations, undermining her authority with apologetic qualifiers. The rooms begin to collapse into each other, creating impossible architectural paradoxes. The chain around her ankle grows heavier with each successful adaptation, because every time she becomes what others need her to be, she moves one step further from whatever truth once lived at her center. The links multiply exponentially, golden chains of gratitude from those who love her flexibility, silver chains of professional advancement, platinum chains of social acceptance. Soon she can barely breathe under the weight of all that beautiful bondage. As Schopenhauer observed, a man can be himself only so long as he is alone. But Evelyn has never learned to be alone with herself. The will has convinced her that survival depends on being everyone except who she actually is. The revelation comes during a dinner party where all her worlds collide. Mother, lover, colleagues, friends, all seated around the same table, each expecting their version of Evelyn to appear. She stands in the center of the room, paralyzed, as the competing demands create a psychic feedback loop. The carefully constructed rooms of her identity collapse like a house of cards, leaving her standing naked in her own truth. She has no idea who she is when no one is watching. The guests stare at her frozen form, and in their confusion, she finally sees the price of her shape-shifting. She has become so skilled at being everyone's perfect woman that she has vanished entirely, leaving behind only the echoes of other people's needs bouncing off the empty walls of her abandoned self. This is the psychology of people-pleasing, taken to its pathological extreme, what researchers call self-abandonment in service of attachment. First described by psychologists studying codependent relationships, it manifests today in the exhaustion of constant code switching, the anxiety of maintaining multiple social media personas, and the depression that comes from succeeding at being someone you don't recognize. Through Schopenhauer's philosophical lens, this represents the will's most sophisticated trap. It convinces us that love requires the complete erasure of self, when authentic love actually demands the courage to be known as we truly are. The will promises that if we just become perfectly adaptable, we'll finally be safe from abandonment. But instead, we abandon ourselves so completely that even when others love us, we cannot feel it because there's no coherent self left to receive that love. The serpent of false love coils around the shapeshifter, not through possession, but through the gradual dissolution of everything worth possessing. It strangles by offering the illusion of universal acceptance while systematically eliminating anyone who might be genuinely acceptable. What version of yourself are you performing right now, and for whom? In which rooms of your life have you become a stranger to yourself? And what would happen if you dared to disappoint the people who love your performance more than your truth? The architect of invisible chains stands surrounded by admirers who love her completely and not at all, each one holding the key to a lock she has forgotten how to open because she has forgotten there was ever anything worth freeing. A man sits by a moonlit lake, casting his line again and again into waters so still they mirror the stars. He has been fishing here for 7 years, always catching something, never catching what he seeks. Tonight, something finally takes the bait, and when he reels it in, he discovers he has hooked his own face, staring back from the surface, mouth agape with the same hunger that brought him to these waters. You know this feeling, that gnawing certainty that the perfect relationship is always one conversation, one date, one vulnerable confession away. The way you scroll through possibilities like prayers, each swipe a small offering to the God of maybe this time. It's not about loneliness. It's about the mathematical impossibility of being completely known and still completely loved. Enter David, our fisherman, though he doesn't yet understand what he's hunting. His apartment has become a museum of almost, concert tickets, from dates that ended with polite kisses instead of passion, restaurant receipts from dinners where conversation flowed like wine but led nowhere deeper than friendly compatibility. His phone contains hundreds of contacts, each name a small monument to connection that stopped just short of revelation. At the lake of his unconscious, David cast his line with the precision of someone who has refined his technique through countless failures. The water reflects not just the moon, but his own desperate hunger made visible. Tonight, the lake has transformed into something altogether more surreal. Its surface ripples with the faces of everyone he's ever tried to love, each reflection slightly distorted, slightly wrong. Their features shift and blend like oil on water. Sarah's laugh with Emma's eyes, Jennifer's intelligence wearing Maria's smile. The fishing line cuts through these phantom faces, searching for something that exists beneath the surface of all his relationships. David has learned to bait his hook with carefully curated versions of himself. The funny David for women who seem sad, the intellectual David for those who read philosophy, the wounded David for the ones who seem drawn to healing. Each persona is technically true, but none contains the full creature that lives in his depths. Hours pass. The moon traces its arc across the star-drunk sky, and still David casts and reels. The water grows darker, more viscous, like liquid obsidian that reflects too perfectly. He begins to notice that each face in the water wears the same expression, a hunger that matches his own, eyes that search his features for something he cannot provide because he has never learned to provide it for himself. The bait changes throughout the night. Sometimes it's vulnerability, offered like a gift to women who seem strong enough to carry it. Sometimes it's success, dangled before those who appear to need security. Sometimes it's potential, the promise of who he might become if the right person loved him into existence. But always, the line comes back empty, carrying nothing but the taste of his own need. As Schopenhauer knew, we forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people. But David has forfeited 4/4, leaving only the echo of other people's desires masquerading as his own authentic self. Then, at 3 a.m., when the lake has become a mirror of pure possibility, something takes the bait. The line goes taut with a weight David has never felt before. He reels slowly, his heart hammering with the possibility that this time, finally, he has caught what he's been seeking. The resistance is unlike anything from his years of failed connections. This feels substantial, real, alive with its own purpose. What breaks the surface defies all logic. His own face, mouth opened around his hook, eyes wide with recognition and horror. Not a reflection, something more solid, more accusatory. It speaks with his voice, but words he's never dared to think. I am what you've been trying to catch. I am what you've been using as bait. I am what you abandoned at the bottom of this lake 7 years ago, when you decided that love meant becoming whatever others needed you to become. David stares at his captured self, and in that moment understands the cruel mathematics of his romantic failures. He has been trying to fish for love using pieces of his own authenticity as bait, never understanding that each time he casts that line, he loses more of whatever might actually be worth catching. This is what psychology calls the false self in romantic relationships, a pattern first identified by object relations theorist Donald Winnicott, where individuals develop such sophisticated adaptive personas that they lose access to their authentic emotions and desires. It manifests today in the exhaustion of dating apps, where we curate ourselves into algorithmic attractiveness, in the anxiety of early relationships, where we're terrified that being genuinely known will mean being abandoned, and in the depression that follows successful performances of love that leave us feeling more alone than ever. Through Schopenhauer's lens, this is the will's cruelest joke. It convinces us that love is something we must earn through strategic self-presentation, when love is actually what happens when we dare to exist without strategy. The will promises that if we just perfect our romantic technique, we'll finally catch the relationship that will complete us. But every technique moves us further from the completeness that exists only in undefended authenticity. The serpent of false love coils around the fisherman, not through the relationships he can't catch, but through the self he keeps using as bait, until nothing remains but the hunger and the hook, casting endlessly into waters that reflect only his own desperate need. What version of yourself are you using as bait, and for whom are you performing the role of perfect catch? What parts of your authentic self have you sacrificed to the lake of others' expectations? And what would you need to stop fishing for in order to finally surface? The fisherman sits by the moonlit lake, holding the hook that has finally caught what he was always seeking and always running from: himself, unedited, unstrategic, uncomfortably real, asking to be loved, not for what he can become, but for what he has always been. A woman sits surrounded by wedding dresses she will never wear, each gown meticulously crafted from the happiness she observes in others. Her fingers bleed from sewing with threads of envy, so fine they're nearly invisible, and every stitch pulls her further from any possibility of her own joy. She has become a master at creating beautiful things from her own beautiful suffering. You've worn these borrowed clothes before. That smile you perfect while watching engagement announcements scroll past on your phone, each ring photo a small needle to the soft places in your chest. The way you've learned to say, "I'm so happy for you," with exactly the right inflection of genuine joy, while something hungry and unnamed coils tighter around your ribs. It's not that you don't want others to be happy. It's that their happiness seems to exist in a country where you don't speak the language. Meet Celeste, our seamstress of impossible dreams. Her workshop exists in the liminal space between desire and despair, where the walls are lined with mirrors that reflect not her own image, but glimpses of the lives she believes she should be living. The air shimmers with golden particles, fragments of other people's joy that she collects and weaves into elaborate fantasies. Her fingers have grown so skilled at this alchemy that she can transform pure longing into tangible beauty. Wedding dresses that smell like first love, business suits that rustle with the sound of applause, evening gowns that glitter with the confidence she observes but cannot inhabit. Each dress tells the story of a life she's witnessed from the outside. The ivory silk number was inspired by her college roommate's wedding 3 years ago. Celeste spent the ceremony cataloging every detail, from the way the bride's father's hands shook as he lifted her veil, to the particular quality of light that seemed to follow the happy couple like a personal sun. She went home that night and began cutting patterns, using her memory as measurements, her envy as thread. The midnight blue cocktail dress came from watching her coworker receive a promotion Celeste had wanted but never fought for. She sat in the back of the celebration party, nursing a drink and studying the way success looked when it wore someone else's skin. Relaxed shoulders, easy laughter, the kind of eye contact that speaks of inner certainty. That night, she sewed until dawn, her tears salt-staining the fabric as she tried to capture the essence of professional confidence in tucks and seams. But here's where the fable grows dark. As Celeste perfects her craft, the dresses begin to move on their own. They rustle with phantom memories, sway as if worn by invisible bodies, living the lives she's borrowed from observation. The workshop fills with the sound of celebration, she has never experienced firsthand. Champagne glasses clinking, heels clicking on dance floors, the whispered intimacies of couples who found each other instead of finding reasons why they couldn't be found. The mirrors multiply, reflecting not just absent joys, but absent selves, all the versions of Celeste who might have existed if she had chosen courage over careful observation, action over analysis, vulnerability over the safety of standing at the edges of other people's happiness. Each reflection wears one of her unwearable dresses, living one of her unlived lives, and they all turn to stare at her with accusation, brighten as thread. As Schopenhauer understood, envy in human beings is like a virus that feeds on success, but Celeste's envy has evolved beyond simple resentment into something more sophisticated and self-destructive, the compulsive transformation of her own deprivation into art that celebrates everyone else's abundance. The breaking point comes when Celeste receives her own wedding invitation, not to attend, to design. The bride, a distant acquaintance, has heard about Celeste's skill and wants her to create something impossibly romantic. As Celeste takes measurements for a dress that will celebrate the very happiness she has spent years observing but never claiming, she realizes she has become so expert at crafting joy for others that she has forgotten how to want it for herself. Standing in her workshop of beautiful things born from beautiful suffering, Celeste holds the wedding dress she could wear to her own ceremony. If she had ever learned how to be a bride instead of a witness, the dress fits perfectly because it was sewn from her own measurements of longing. But when she looks in the mirror, she sees something that breaks her heart, herself transformed into the very happiness she thought existed only in other people's lives. This is what psychology calls vicarious living or comparative happiness, first studied by social psychologists exploring how social media affects mental health. It manifests today in the depression that follows, scrolling through highlight reels, the anxiety of measuring our behind the scenes against others' carefully curated performance pieces, and the learned helplessness that comes from believing joy is a limited resource that others have claimed before we learn to compete. Through Schopenhauer's philosophical framework, this represents the will's most insidious trap. It convinces us that happiness is something we must witness and analyze before we can claim it, when happiness actually emerges from the courage to live our own lives regardless of how they compare to anyone else's story. The will whispers that if we just study enough examples of joy, we'll eventually understand the formula. But each borrowed dream moves us further from the original desires that might actually bring us satisfaction. The serpent of false love coils around the seamstress, not through denying her happiness, but through convincing her that happiness is a skill that must be learned from others, a dress that must be tailored from someone else's pattern, a dream that only becomes valid after it has been validated by external success. What dreams are you sowing from other people's happiness? And what original desires have you abandoned in service of becoming an expert in everyone else's joy? What would you need to stop observing in order to finally start living? And what dress would you make if you used your own measurements instead of borrowing from lives that fit someone else's body? The seamstress of borrowed dreams sits surrounded by the beautiful impossibility of her own longing made manifest, finally understanding that the most exquisite dress is worthless if it was never designed for the body that needs to wear it. A man stands in a room made entirely of maps, each one charting the geography of a relationship that exists only in his mind. With meticulous precision, he traces routes through conversations he's never had, marks cities where he's never traveled, with lovers who've never spoken his name. His compass points not north, but toward a future that becomes more impossible with each perfectly detailed plan. When someone finally knocks on his door, he panics, because real countries never match the beautiful accuracy of imaginary ones. You've been this cartographer, that moment when possibility feels more tangible than reality, when the relationship that exists in your head seems more vivid, more manageable, more perfect than any messy human connection could ever be. The way you can spend hours crafting the perfect text message response, mapping out conversations like military campaigns, planning emotional territories you'll never actually explore, because the real person keeps insisting on being themselves instead of the character you've written for them. Meet Thomas, our architect of impossible geographies. His study has evolved beyond a room into a cathedral of hypothetical love, where the walls breathe with the weight of accumulated fantasy. Maps cover every surface, not of places, but of people. Sarah from accounting becomes a continent of coffee shop conversations and shared lunch breaks. Her personality, color-coded according to his observations, blue for her Monday melancholy, gold for Friday optimism, red for the anger he has glimpsed but never experienced directed at him. He's charted the seasons of her moods, the weather patterns of her attention, the trade routes that might carry him from friendly colleague to something more substantial. The desk drawers overflow with detailed itineraries for dates he's never suggested, the museum route that would showcase his intellectual depth, the restaurant choice that would prove his sophistication, the weekend getaway that would demonstrate his capacity for romance. Each plan includes contingencies, alternate routes for different versions of how these relationships might unfold. He's become a master of emotional logistics, calculating the exact timing required to transform workplace pleasantries into intimate knowledge. But watch what happens as Thomas's cartography grows more sophisticated. The maps begin to move, not like living things, but like complex systems responding to data. He feeds them through careful observation. When Sarah mentions she likes jazz, entire regions of Thomas's imaginary relationship country reorganize themselves around concert venues and vinyl record shops. When she laughs at his joke in the elevator, new highways appear, connecting previously isolated territories of possibility. The room pulses with the machinery of magical thinking. Compass needles spinning toward outcomes he can control. Measuring tools that calculate the exact distance between where they are and where he needs them to be. Thomas has developed instruments for mapping emotional topography, the precise elevation of her interest when he mentions his weekend pottery class, the latitude and longitude of moments when her attention feels fully his, the atmospheric pressure that indicates whether she might be available for the kind of journey he spent months planning. As Schopenhauer observed, the alchemists, in their search for gold, discovered many other things of greater value. But Thomas's alchemy works in reverse, transforming the potential gold of real connection into elaborate fantasy systems that grow more valuable to him than any authentic relationship could ever be. The crisis arrives when Sarah actually asks Thomas to grab coffee, not the carefully orchestrated museum and dinner expedition he's mapped in detail, just coffee on a random Tuesday because she's having a difficult week and could use friendly company. Thomas stares at her invitation like a tourist holding a guidebook to a country that has suddenly changed all its borders. None of his routes account for spontaneity. None of his plans include the messy variables of Sarah's actual personality, her tendency to interrupt, her surprising political opinions, her habit of checking her phone during conversations. Sitting across from her in a cafe that appears on none of his maps, Thomas realizes the terrible truth. The woman he's been charting for months is a completely different person from the one buying him coffee and talking about her anxiety over her sister's divorce. Real Sarah is more complex, more contradictory, more human than the continent he's named after her. And this Sarah, the one with coffee breath and visible pores and opinions that don't align with his careful observations, might actually like him if he could stop trying to navigate her like territory he needs to conquer. But Thomas has become so skilled at loving the map that he's forgotten how to travel. The real conversation happening across from him feels like chaos compared to the elegant systems he's built to predict and control her. When she reaches across the table and touches his hand, he flinches, not because he doesn't want connection, but because this moment exists outside the geography he's spent so much time perfecting. This is what psychology calls fantasy bonding, or parasocial relationships with real people, a phenomenon first studied in research on celebrity obsession, but now recognized as a broader pattern where individuals develop elaborate emotional relationships with people they barely know. It manifests today in the way we construct entire personalities, from dating app profiles, the relationships we build with social media acquaintances based on curated posts, and the disappointment we feel when real people refuse to behave like the characters we've imagined them to be. Through Schopenhauer's lens, this is perhaps the will's most perfect trap. It allows us to experience all the pleasure of love without any of the risk, uncertainty, or genuine intimacy that makes love meaningful. The will convinces us that perfect planning can eliminate the fundamental unpredictability that makes connection possible, creating elaborate control systems disguised as romantic dedication. The serpent of false love coils around the cartographer, not through preventing him from finding love, but through making imaginary love so detailed, so manageable, so perfectly tailored to his needs that real love seems like a pale, chaotic imitation of the superior country he's learned to inhabit alone. What maps are you drawing of people who exist primarily in your imagination? And what real conversations are you avoiding in service of maintaining the perfect relationships that live only in your mind? How many territories have you explored in fantasy that you've never had the courage to visit in reality? And what would you need to abandon your compass to discover? The cartographer of imaginary countries stands surrounded by the perfect geography of his own longing, holding maps to everywhere he's never been, finally understanding that the most beautiful territory is worthless if you never learn to trust your feet to carry you across unfamiliar ground without knowing exactly where you're going. Standing in his cathedral of hypothetical love, Thomas faces a choice that every human must eventually confront: whether to remain the master of imaginary countries or become a tourist in the messy, unmappable terrain of actual intimacy. The maps whisper their siren song of control and certainty, while outside his window, real people navigate real relationships without guidebooks, finding their way by compass points that shift with every honest word spoken and every genuine risk taken. In the end, Schopenhauer's Serpent reveals its final secret. Love is not the enemy of freedom, but the only path to freedom that doesn't require the elimination of everyone else. The coil tightens, not when we love, but when we try to love without losing our grip on the controls, when we attempt to possess connection without surrendering to the possibility that connection might transform us into someone we didn't plan to become. The 5 fables spiral together like smoke from a dying candle, each story a different chamber in the heart that has learned to protect itself from the very thing it most desperately needs. The collector and the architect, the fisherman and the seamstress, the cartographer, all of them citizens of the same country, the place where love becomes the beautiful poison we drink to avoid the risk of genuine nourishment. But there is another path, one that Schopenhauer glimpsed in his darker moments of honest, the recognition that the serpent's coil can only tighten around what we try to hold. Release the grip on outcome, on control, on the fantasy that love can be earned or managed or mapped, and discover that the serpent was never love at all, but our own fear disguised as devotion. The architecture of self-deception crumbles not through force, but through the simple act of walking away from the beautiful buildings we've constructed to protect ourselves from the weather. Sometimes the storm we've been hiding from is the only thing that can wash us clean.